House of Ushers, Dead Man Dancing, written by Peter Graham, read by David Angus MacDonald. Chapter 7, The Imperial Palace. The Imperial Palace was the crown jewel of Steric's city. It was the tallest and most beautifully designed of all its buildings. Like many others in the city, the Imperial Palace had large, flat upper stories that spread out like lily pond leaves. Around it and within the city beyond could be seen an abundance of lakes, fountains, and water features scattered between the buildings. The Imperial Palace was both a royal residence for Emperor Raphaelax III, guiding father of the Styx people, and the government's administrative center. It contained the council chamber of ministers and representatives, the offices of the civil service, conference facilities, and accommodation for visiting ministers and dignitaries, as well as the barracks for the Styx Imperial Guards. Two of these guards, particularly tall specimens, were at that moment standing on either side of an archway leading to the emperor's personal chambers. The Styx were a humanoid race with toad-like features and markings that looked rather like clown makeup. Many people had discovered that it was often a fatal mistake to address them as clown face. Inside the chambers, the emperor was conducting a walking briefing along one of the many palace corridors with his chancellor, Panlax Panalax. The chancellor was about half the height of the emperor and was obliged to trot in order to keep up with his monarch's longer strides. Both wore the traditional flamboyant robes and headdress of the ancient Styx royal household. Along the corridor, spaced at regular intervals, were the busts of preceding emperors. Panlax couldn't help thinking that most of them were rather brutish-looking characters before his thoughts returned to the matter in hand. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," he said, "but is it absolutely necessary to destroy the world's mediation center?" He was struggling to keep pace with the emperor and hold a discussion. "Oh yes, Panlax," Raphaelax said. "The plan completely depends on it." Panlax felt compelled to at least try to dissuade the emperor from the plan he had just been informed of. "It will create a dangerous political crisis," he said. Raphaelax paused and turned towards Panlax and scowled. "You really don't get it, do you, Panlax?" Raphaelax began walking once more and gestured towards the busts along the corridor on either side of them. "Look at my predecessors, Panlax. What was the first thing each of them did when they became emperor?" Panlax opened his mouth to answer, but the emperor continued before he had a chance to speak. "They expanded the empire." The emperor noticed the bust of a mild, diminutive Styx, quite similar to Panlax in appearance, and stopped. The inscription below read, "Panrift Pangorlax I." "With one exception," he paused. "He was only interested in writing poetry and composing melodies." Raphaelax contemplated for a few moments. "He had to go, of course. If he had been better at his job, you might have been emperor now instead of me, Panlax." "Ha ha ha ha!" The emperor chuckled at the thought. "Yes, Majesty," the chancellor said meekly. "The Nexus system will allow me to reach every part of the galaxy." For a moment, Raphaelax III stared at some distant imagined vision, lost in his own thoughts of greatness and glory. "Imagine all those alien species as subjects of the Styx Empire," the emperor frowned. "We'll probably have to build a wall to keep them away from the palace," he said. Looking down at Panlax, he added, "Now run along, Panlax, and make sure our forces are brought up to readiness. There's a good chap." Panlax bowed to the emperor and withdrew backwards for a few paces before turning and walking away at a brisk pace. Outside of the royal chambers, Panlax walked rapidly down a palace corridor towards his quarters. He was mumbling to himself. On the one hand, he wanted to prevent another Nexus war, and on the other, he didn't want to be horribly executed for treason. Still, he reasoned, as a sleeper agent of the Vigil Security Agency, he had already earned himself a horrible execution. The really important thing was not to get caught. He stopped suddenly when he realized he was mumbling his concerns out loud. He looked around and saw that he had been passing Steck's Imperial guards positioned along the corridor. Luckily, they didn't seem to be rushing forward to arrest him. He remembered that they were trained not to hear or see anything that wasn't a potential threat to the royal court. Wasn't what he was mumbling a potential threat? After all, his ambition was to depose that oaf Raphaelax, but then his aged aunt Sonara often pointed out that his mumbling was quite incoherent. But she was practically deaf anyway. Panlax was beginning to feel a little dizzy trying to follow his own reasoning. Perhaps his standing there and staring at the guards looked even more suspicious. He turned quickly and carried on walking. When he reached the doors to his quarters, he looked furtively up and down the corridor once more before entering. Inside was a large furnished room with doorways that led off into other rooms. Positioned centrally on one wall was an oval, convex, opaque screen mounted in an ornate gold leaf frame. "Good afternoon, Chancellor Panlax. Would you like to hear your messages?" The screen lit up in various overlapping colors as the apartment computer spoke to him. "No! Scan the apartment for surveillance devices." Panlax considered that perhaps he was becoming overly paranoid, but then that was always preferable to being overly dead. "The apartment is clear of surveillance devices," the computer stated pleasantly. Panlax walked over to an ornate shelf with a sculpture of a nude female Stex on it and placed his hand over it. Pausing a moment, he then pushed the sculpture, hinging it open to reveal a crystal communication device that activated immediately and projected the Vigil Security Agency logo into the air above. "Vigil Security Agency," a different computer voice said. "This is Agent Zulu Alpha 1. Priority message. Stex agents are planning to destroy the world's mediation center." Well, thought Panlax, there's no turning back now.